On a barren stretch of frontier land, a poor cowboy shares his last piece of bread with two tribal sisters who can barely stand. His kindness seems small, almost invisible beneath the vast sky, yet it sends ripples through an entire nation. When morning comes, the horizon fills with riders. The chief himself leads them, his arrival shaking the earth. What he brings, gratitude, reward, or warning, will define the fate of the cowboy's simple act forever. The sun was bleeding itself dry across the western rim of the sky, its light spilling gold over the dead grass. Heat still rose from the dirt, slow and shimmering, wrapping the world in a restless haze. A lone horse trudged through that emptiness, hooves sinking into dust that had forgotten rain. On its back rode a man, hat pulled low, coat faded from 1,000 suns, eyes hollow as a dry well. Illy Boone had not eaten in 2 days. His rifle hung at his side, useless as the parched earth around him. He had chased rabbits, followed tracks that vanished in the wind, and found nothing but silence. The land was empty, even hunger had lost its edge, replaced by a dull ache that felt like part of his bones. He spoke to the horse in a whisper, more to himself than the animal. "Just a little further, boy, riverbeds up ahead." The horse snorted softly, and they moved on through the brittle weeds, both too tired to believe their own hope. The world around them was painted in dying colors, amber, rust, and sorrow. A hawk circled high above, its cry cutting through the evening hush like a prayer unanswered. The horizon seemed endless, a stretch of nothing that tested the heart more than any battle could. Then Illy saw them, two figures, small and motionless, lying beside the cracked bed of what once was a river. At first he thought they were ghosts, mirages born of hunger. But as he drew closer, the shapes sharpened into truth. Two young women, skin darkened by sun and struggle, hair tangled with dust and wind. One's arm draped protectively over the other. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching against the dry clay. The air held its breath. He knelt beside them and saw the shallow rise and fall of their chests, alive, barely. Their lips were cracked, faces streaked with salt and earth. Torn leather wraps clung to them like the last defense of pride. They were tribal, Apache, by the beadwork faintly gleaming on one girl's wrist. Illy looked away for a moment. The memory of fire, of a village burning, screams swallowed by smoke, flashed behind his eyes. He shut it out. That was another life, another man. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out what little he had left. A single piece of hard bread, broken and dry as the land itself. He stared at it, thumb tracing the rough edge, knowing what it meant to let it go. The wind whispered through the grass. The sky dimmed another shade. He broke the bread in two. Without a word, he placed half beside the older sister's hand, the other near the younger's lips. The elder stirred first, eyes opening, black pools of confusion and fear. Her hand moved weakly toward the bread, but stopped when she saw him. For a long moment, neither moved. Just the sound of wind and distant thunder rolling somewhere beyond the plains. Illy lowered his gaze, voice rough from thirst. "Eat if you can." The younger girl stirred then, whispering something in a tongue he barely recognized. The elder lifted the bread, trembling, and pressed it to her sister's mouth. She took a bite so small it could have been a prayer. Illy stood, his stomach twisted at the scent of food so close, yet his body had already forgotten how to crave. He turned back to his horse. Behind him, the elder spoke, a fragile sound carried by the wind. He couldn't understand her words, but he heard the tone, gratitude, suspicion, pain, all wrapped into one breath. He didn't answer. As he mounted his horse, the last rays of sun set fire to the horizon. The land seemed to glow for a heartbeat, gold on dust, mercy on despair. The sisters watched him through half, closed eyes, the bread still clutched between their fingers like a relic. Illy rode away slow, head bowed, the faint taste of guilt rising like bile. His shadow stretched long across the dying ground until it merged with the coming night. Behind him, the desert fell silent again, holding the moment like a secret only the wind would remember. Night crawled in slow, wrapping the plains in a velvet dark. The last orange shimmer faded behind the hills, leaving the world to the moon and the mournful cries of coyotes. Illy Boone rode on, the creak of his saddle the only heartbeat left in that silence. The land around him was nothing but bones, a skeleton of rivers long gone, trees stripped to ghosts. He'd lived in it so long that he had begun to resemble it, quiet, hollow, and too proud to beg for mercy. When the faint outline of his shack came into view, a crooked silhouette against the stars, relief didn't come. Home was just four walls nailed around a memory. The wind slipped through the cracks, carrying sand and loneliness in equal measure. He tied his horse to the post, its ribs showing under the pale moonlight. He brushed a hand across its mane, a silent thank you that words couldn't carry. Then he stepped inside. The door groaned, tired as the man who opened it. A lantern flickered on the table, its flame struggling against the draft. The room smelled of dust, gun oil, and old sorrow. He dropped his hat, hung his coat, and sat at the edge of his cot, staring at the bare floorboards like they might answer for the day. He had done something small, something right, yet it felt like his heart had been dragged through fire again. The faces of the two sisters hovered behind his eyes, fragile, starving, too young to know the world had already decided their worth. He pressed his palms to his eyes and tried to pray, but the words had long since left him. Outside, thunder muttered far away, like the earth remembering anger. Illy leaned back, bones aching. From his saddlebag he took the small Bible he carried since the war. The pages were worn, edges torn. He flipped it open at random and read what his eyes landed on. And be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. He stared at the words, lips dry, a faint tremor in his fingers. Angels. He had seen enough men die to know there were few angels in this world. Yet something about the verse lingered. He closed the book, letting it fall beside him. The storm came closer, wind whistling through the cracks, stirring the ashes in the fireplace. He rose, tossing a few splinters of wood into the pit, lighting them with a flint. Orange light bloomed, soft and trembling. The warmth did little for the cold that lived inside him. He knelt there for a while, feeding the fire, listening to the slow drip of rain outside. His stomach twisted again, reminding him of the bread now gone. He smiled bitterly. Guess that's fair. He murmured, voice gravel low. They needed it more than I did. He poured a cup of water, sipped half, and set it down. The rest he saved, habit carved by scarcity. Lightning flashed through the window, lighting the plains for a heartbeat, and in that white glare, he thought he saw something move far beyond the fence. A shadow too small for a man, too still for an animal. He went still, another flash, nothing there, just the trembling grass. His mind was tired, seeing ghosts where there were none. Still, when he lay back down, sleep did not come. It never did. He stared at the low ceiling, watching the dance of firelight, and the past began to seep through the cracks again, the kind of memories that no whiskey could drown. A village burning under the night sky. Horses screaming, a child crying out before the sound was swallowed by flames. His orders that day had been clear, his conscience less so. He had carried out both. Now, years later, he could still smell the smoke every time the rain came. He turned to his side, shutting his eyes hard, but the faces wouldn't fade. He thought of the two girls again, the way the older one had shielded the younger with her arm, even unconscious. The way her eyes, when they opened, had looked at him with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite trust. For a moment, in that cracked silence, he almost felt something like peace, almost. The wind howled through the chimney, bending the flame. Outside, rain began to fall harder, tapping against the roof like 1,000 small hands. He drifted into half sleep, caught between the storm outside and the one inside his chest. And somewhere out there, in the dark beyond his fence, two faint figures lay under the same rain, the sisters he had left behind. The elder held the younger close, shielding her from the wind, in her trembling hand a piece of half-eaten bread. When lightning crossed the plains again, their faces were turned toward the same horizon Illy Boone was dreaming of. The dying sun was gone, but its promise lingered that somewhere between hunger and mercy, two worlds had met, and neither would ever be the same again. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. The land still smoked in places where lightning had kissed the ground. The sky, pale and bruised, carried the scent of wet dust and regret. Illy Boone woke with a start, sweat clinging to his neck. The fire in the hearth had died to cold ash, but the dream still burned in him, the same one that came every time rain touched the plains. Flames licking through the timbers of an Apache camp. A cry he could not forget. His own hand holding the torch, he sat up slowly, staring at the gray light bleeding through the cracks in the window shutters. The room felt too small for his guilt, too quiet for the noise inside him. He pushed to his feet, moving like an old man, though he was not yet 40. The floorboards groaned. He poured the last of the water into a tin cup and drank in slow sips, as if each swallow carried memory away. Outside, the horse shifted restlessly. The smell of damp earth hung thick, sweet, and sickly. Illy stepped out, pulling his coat tight against the chill. The plains stretched endless, washed clean by rain, the world made new again, though not for him. He rubbed the horse's neck and muttered, "We keep movin', don't we?" The animal flicked its ears, eyes soft and knowing. But the land wasn't done speaking. Down by the riverbed dry yesterday, slick with thin rivulets, now he saw footprints. Small, bare, 2 sets. His throat tightened. They had survived. He followed the tracks a few paces before stopping himself. The prints led west, toward the cottonwoods, toward nowhere safe. The settlers would shoot them on sight. The soldiers worse. He clenched his fists, torn between instinct and fear. A memory flared the look in the elder sister's eyes, that mix of pride and desperation. He could walk away and never see them again. Pretend mercy had no aftermath. But mercy always leaves a mark. He turned back to his shack, grabbed his rifle, and slung a blanket over his shoulder. The sun broke weakly through the clouds as he started down toward the river. The mud sucked at his boots. A crow watched from a fence post, tilting its head as if judging him. The air smelled of iron, the scent of rain over rust. After a mile, he found them. The younger sister was awake, sitting against a fallen log, her face streaked with mud and faint life. The elder knelt beside her, still guarding, still unbroken. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, spinning with sudden fear, a stone clenched in her hand. Illy raised both palms. "I ain't here to harm you." Her eyes narrowed, dark and sharp. She didn't understand the words, but she understood tone, the kind that carried no threat, only weariness. He pointed toward the horizon, then toward his shack. Shelter, food, warmth. The younger one coughed, weakly. The elder looked at her sister, then back at him. The silence between them stretched long enough for the wind to change. Finally, she nodded once, curtly. Illy motioned for them to follow. They walked slow, careful, every step a test of trust. When they reached the shack, the sun had risen higher, catching on the wet fields. Steam rose from the soil, curling like ghosts returning to the sky. Inside, he lit the fire again, its glow spilling warmth into the cracks of the room. He tore a strip from an old sackcloth and soaked it in water, handing it to the elder. She pressed it gently to her sister's forehead, eyes softening despite herself. Illy stepped back, unsure what to do with his hands. He wasn't used to company, especially not this kind. He glanced at the two of them, at the younger girl's shallow breathing, the elder's steady watchfulness, and felt something stir he hadn't felt in years. Responsibility. He busied himself with the fire, feeding it small twigs, avoiding their gaze. He could feel it, though, the weight of their silence, the unspoken question of why he helped, because he owed something, because he was tired of ghosts, because the bread had meant more than he'd known. He sat on the floor near the door, leaning his rifle against the wall, staring into the flames. The elder spoke softly to her sister in Apache. He didn't understand, but her voice carried tenderness and fear, the kind that only comes from love shaped by loss. After a long while, the younger one slept. The elder turned her eyes on him, studying him like one studies a wild animal that might help or might harm. She said one word, slow and careful, as though testing him. Why, it was the only English she seemed to know. Illy looked up. The fire crackled between them. He thought of all the answers he could give, none worth the air they'd take. So he spoke the truth, because you were hungry. Her gaze lingered, searching him for something she could name. She didn't find it, but she didn't look away either. Outside, the plains began to dry under the new sun. The storm had ended, but something else had begun, quiet as breath, fragile as hope. Illy Boone didn't know it yet, but mercy had already called his name, and the desert was listening. The crackle of the dying campfire was the only sound left in the night. Coyotes howled far off in the canyon, but the prairie seemed to hold its breath, as if watching what fate would do next. Illy turned the loaf of bread over in his rough palms. It was barely enough for one man, but he'd given it away to those two young women, strangers, without a thought. Now, hunger gnawed at his gut, but something else weighed heavier, a sense of quiet unease. He leaned against the wagon wheel, eyes drifting toward the dark hills where the sisters had vanished. Their words echoed in his mind, soft, foreign, and ancient. He hadn't understood a thing, but their gratitude had been clear in their eyes. Then came the wind. A sudden gust swept through the prairie, fierce and strange, making the ashes of his fire swirl like a storm of spirits. Illy rose slowly, hat tilted down, eyes narrowing at the horizon. The moonlight shimmered on something moving, a flicker of torches, far off in the dark. Tribesmen, he muttered, hand resting instinctively on the old revolver at his side. He'd seen war parties before, but never this late, never this quiet. The ground began to thrum soft at first, then heavier, like distant thunder. Illy crouched behind his wagon, scanning the dark. The torches grew brighter, dozens of them, moving in formation. Then he saw something that froze him still. A giant feathered banner, held high above the riders, glowing under the moonlight, the same symbol that had hung from the necklaces of those two sisters. Illy's breath caught in his throat. Dear Lord, what did I just step into? The riders halted at a distance, silhouettes tall and proud, their horses restless under the weight of the silence. For a moment no one moved. Then a single horn blew deep and haunting, rolling across the plains like a cry from another world. Illy gripped his hat, his pulse pounding. He didn't know it yet, but this night, this one act of kindness had set the prairie ablaze. Because by dawn, the chief himself would come, and with him, an army that would change Illy's life forever. The first light of dawn bled over the ridge, turning the frost on Illy's fields into rivers of gold. He hadn't slept. All night, the glow of distant torches had burned on the horizon like watchful eyes. When the sun finally climbed high enough to touch the plains, Illy saw it, a sight that hollowed his chest with awe and fear. They came from the east, a sea of riders, hundreds hundreds upon hundreds, their horses kicking up clouds of red dust that rolled like storm clouds across the land. The morning light glinted off painted shields, long lances, and silver ornaments woven into their braids. At the front road, a single figure draped in furs and feathers, his horse black as midnight. His presence was enough to silence even the restless wind. Every rider behind him moved with reverence. Illy stepped out from behind his wagon, his hat low, the barrel of his rifle resting across his arm, not in threat, but in wariness. His heart pounded like a drum. The riders drew closer, and he could finally see their faces, strong, solemn, proud. These were warriors, seasoned by years of defending their lands, yet their eyes were not hostile, they were searching. Then the black horse halted just yards away. The leader dismounted slowly. He was tall, towering, broad, shouldered, with long gray hair braided in strands of silver and red. Across his chest hung a medallion carved from bone, the same tribal crest Illy had seen around the sisters' necks. For a long moment no one spoke, Then the man's voice broke the silence, deep, controlled, yet trembling with restrained power. "You are the one," he said, "the stranger who gave his bread to my daughters." Ili's breath hitched. He took a half-step back. "Your daughters," he repeated softly. The chief nodded. Behind him, the crowd of warriors parted, and from among them stepped the two young women. Their clothes had changed, no longer torn and humble, but rich in tribal color, wrapped in ceremonial beads and feathers that shimmered in the morning light. Ili couldn't believe his eyes. The younger one smiled faintly, eyes glistening with gratitude. The elder lowered her head with quiet dignity. The chief looked upon Ili with something between respect and sorrow. "In our lands," he said, "a man who gives his last bread to the hungry earns a debt that cannot be repaid with gold, only with honor." He motioned to his warriors, and in a single motion 200 spears struck the ground, a sound that thundered across the plains like a vow. Ili swallowed hard, unsure whether to bow or run. The chief stepped closer, his shadow falling over Ili like the weight of destiny. "You saved the blood of my tribe," the chief said, "and now the blood of my tribe stands ready to protect yours." The wind shifted, the prairie fell silent again. Something powerful, something ancient had just been set in motion. The wind grew still, as if the prairie itself were holding its breath. Ili stood motionless, the weight of 200 warriors' eyes pressing down on him like a mountain. The chief's gaze softened, but his voice carried the thunder of years. "You wonder why my daughters wandered your land, barefoot and starving," he said. "You wonder why a chief's blood would sleep hungry under another man's sky." Ili didn't speak. He only nodded once, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. The chief's eyes turned toward the horizon, a place where the rising sun met the scarred edge of the hills. "Because there is no peace anymore," he said quietly. "A band of traders from the south came months ago promising friendship, trade, and iron tools, but they brought lies. They brought sickness. They took our horses, burned our grain, and when my eldest refused to bow, they took her sister too." Ili's throat tightened. He glanced at the younger woman, her eyes dropped, hiding the ghosts of what she'd endured. The chief went on, his voice breaking once, only once. "We hunted them for weeks, following trails of ash and blood. But a storm came and my daughters were lost. I sent riders across every plain, but no sign, until this morning." He turned to Ili. "And then I heard of the man who shared his last bread with two strangers, a man who asked no name, no reward." A heavy silence hung between them. The warriors behind the chief shifted slightly, waiting for his command. Then the chief stepped forward, slow, deliberate, until he stood so close that Ili could feel the warmth of his breath. "You saved what I could not protect," he said. "In our law that binds us, your life is now part of our tribe's honor." Ili took off his hat, eyes lowered in quiet respect. "I didn't do it for honor," he said. "They were hungry and I had a little to give." The chief studied him, this lone cowboy, worn and dusted, yet holding the calm of a mountain. Then the old man's stern face broke into something rare, a faint, solemn smile. "And that," he said, "is why the Great Spirit sent us to your door." He raised his arm, and the line of warriors shifted, forming a great circle around Ili's small, weather-beaten cabin. Spears gleamed under the sun like rivers of fire. "From this day," the chief declared, voice echoing across the plains, "no harm shall touch this man. No storm shall strike his home unguarded. No enemy shall cross his field without meeting the wrath of my riders." The ground trembled as the warriors struck their spears into the earth, once more a vow sealed by the dust and dawn. Ili stood silent, overwhelmed, his heart heavy and full all at once. He glanced toward the two sisters. The elder bowed her head, and the younger smiled, tears in her eyes. In that moment, Ili realized something he hadn't in all his lonely years, that sometimes kindness given to strangers comes back as destiny. The sun burned red in the sky, and from the ridge beyond, a hawk circled, its cry sharp, almost warning. Because somewhere far beyond those hills, the men who had brought pain to the chief's tribe were still alive and heading west, and fate was not done with Ili yet. The day stretched long and silent after the warriors left. Only the echo of hooves remained, fading into the wind like ghosts disappearing into the horizon. Illy stood by the fence, hat in hand, eyes scanning the trail where they had vanished. The prairie, once quiet and familiar, now felt heavier. Older, he'd lived through droughts, wildfires, and storms, but nothing like this. Nothing that made the earth itself feel alive with unseen eyes. Inside his small cabin, the morning fire had died to a soft glow. On the table sat the loaf of bread he'd baked the night before untouched. He wasn't hungry, his mind was too full. He replayed every word the chief had spoken about the traders, the sickness, the burned villages. The kind of cruelty that came dressed as progress. He'd seen it before, men with greed in their hearts and law on their lips. As the wind pushed against the wooden walls, Illy lit a match and set the fire again. His reflection in the window was weary, the eyes of a man who knew peace never lasted long on the frontier. Then came the knock, soft, hesitant, not the knock of a stranger. Illy opened the door, and there she was. The younger sister standing under the pale morning light. Her dark hair caught the sun, her eyes filled with the same quiet gratitude that had haunted him all night. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "My father asked me to bring you this." She held out a small leather pouch. Illy took it gently, feeling the weight not much, maybe a handful of silver beads, carved with tribal markings. He said, "These are not for trade," she continued. "They are a promise, a bond between our blood and yours." Illy stared at the pouch, then looked up at her. "I don't need this," he said softly. "I didn't help for a reward." Her lips curved in a small smile. "It's not a reward," she replied. "It's remembrance." For a moment, they stood there, two souls from different worlds, bound by a single act of kindness neither had planned. The silence between them was gentle, until Illy noticed her glancing nervously toward the hills. "Something wrong?" he asked. She hesitated, eyes darting over his shoulder toward the open plains. "My father feels eyes on the wind," she whispered. "The men who hurt us, they don't forget shame easily." Illy's stomach turned to stone. He stepped out onto the porch, scanning the horizon. Nothing, just the endless prairie swaying under the sun. "You think they're coming here?" he asked. She nodded faintly. "They will follow the trail, they always do." Illy looked toward the barn, then the cabin, the only two structures for miles. He knew the land was open, vulnerable. "Then I'd better get ready," he muttered. She caught his arm, her grip firm despite her small frame. "You don't understand," she said, eyes wide. "They are not just men. They travel with guns and with the darkness they carry." Illy met her gaze, steady, calm. "Miss," he said quietly, "I've met darkness before." The wind shifted again, colder this time. A hawk cried somewhere above, circling wide over the open plains. Far out in the distance, barely a speck on the horizon, a single trail of dust rose from the earth. Someone was coming. The line of dust grew wider, rising like smoke from a far-off fire. Illy's eyes narrowed as he stepped off the porch, his boots crunching dry earth. The girl followed, her breath shallow, her fingers clutching the side of her shawl. The morning sun hung low, blazing red through the haze. A stillness crept over the plains, that kind of silence that only comes before trouble. Illy squinted toward the horizon. At first, it looked like mirages dancing in the heat. But then the shapes took form, men on horseback, riding hard, maybe 10, maybe more, each one armed, each one coming straight toward his land. He turned back toward the young woman. "You were right," he said quietly. "They found the trail." Her face paled, eyes fixed on the riders. "They'll kill you for helping us," she whispered. "You should leave." Illy shook his head. "I've run enough in my life." He walked into the barn, grabbed his rifle from the wall, and checked the chamber. Only 6 rounds left. He'd saved them for coyotes, never imagined he'd need them for men. The woman stepped closer, her hands trembling. "My father will come," she said. "He promised, don't count on it." Illy interrupted softly. "By the time he gets here, it'll be too late." He loaded another shell, the metallic click echoing in the hollow barn. Dust floated through the shafts of sunlight. "You can hide in the root cellar," he said. "They're after me now," but she shook her head. "No, if you fall, I fall too. You saved us once, now it's our turn." Illy looked at her, this girl who had known nothing but fear and loss, and for the first time in years he felt something stir in him again. Not pity, not duty, just purpose. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, watching as the riders came closer. He could see their faces now rough, dust-caked, eyes sharp with cruelty. The one in front wore a long black coat that flapped behind him like wings. Illy knew the type, men who took what they wanted because no one ever stopped them. They pulled their horses to a stop about 50 yards out. The leader grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Well, look here," he called out. The poor fool who fed the chief's brats. Laughter rippled through the group. Illy said nothing. He stood still, rifle resting against his arm, eyes calm, the kind of calm that only men who have buried too many friends carry. "You've made trouble for yourself, stranger," the man in the black coat said. "Those girls belong to us. They ran and you brought 'em back to life. That was your mistake." Illy's jaw tightened. "You got the wrong idea," he said. "They belong to no one." The laughter stopped. The leader's grin vanished. "Then I guess we'll just have to teach you what happens to men who don't mind their own business." He raised his hand and in a flash, the riders spread out, forming a half-circle. Guns gleamed in the sun. The girl stepped behind Illy, her breath trembling. He whispered without turning, "When I start shooting, you run for the creek. Don't look back." But she didn't move. "I'm not leaving you." The leader spurred his horse forward, shouting, "Kill him slow." Then came the roar of gunfire. Smoke exploded across the field. Illy dropped to one knee behind the fence post and fired once, twice, 3 times, the recoil shaking through his arm. One rider fell. Another spun out, his horse shrieking in pain. The girl screamed as bullets tore through the wooden porch. Splinters flew, dust filled the air, and Illy kept firing, calm and steady as a man digging his own grave. Then silence. The wind carried the last echo of the shots into the hills. 2 men lay still. The rest turned their horses, pulling back toward the ridge, their leader shouting curses into the dust. Illy's rifle clicked empty. He lowered it slowly. The young woman ran to him, eyes wide with fear and awe. You stopped them." Illy shook his head. "No," he said, voice low. "They'll be back." He looked toward the distant ridge where the black-coated man had vanished into the sun, and he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Night settled slow and heavy across the plains, wrapping the shack in a blanket of silence. The wind had gone still, and the stars burned cold and close, hanging low enough to touch. Inside, the only light came from a small oil lamp flickering on the table, its flame trembling like a soul caught between guilt and grace. Illy Boone sat there, his hands rough and still stained with gunpowder. The smell of it clung to his clothes, mixing with the dust and sweat of a man who had fought for something he didn't fully understand. The 2 sisters sat across from him, quiet as shadows. The younger one, Nita, had fallen asleep against her sister's shoulder, her face pale but peaceful. The older, Tala, kept her eyes fixed on Illy, not in fear anymore, but in something deeper, harder to name. He broke the silence first. "You should have run when I told you," he said. Tala's voice was soft, yet steady. "And leave you to die alone? No. My father taught me better than that." Illy looked at her across the wavering light. "Your father sounds like a man who's seen his share of loss." A long pause. Then she nodded slowly. "He's the chief of our people, or was. He went into the canyons weeks ago to find us after the raid. We never saw him again." The words carried the weight of a wound too deep to heal. Illy lowered his gaze, feeling that old ache stir in his chest, the one that had followed him since the war, since the fire, since that cursed village. "What tribe?" he asked quietly. "Karikahua," she said. The name hit him like a hammer. His breath caught, eyes fixed on the flickering flame. The Karikahua, the same village, the same war. The same night he rode under orders to burn their homes, a night of screams and smoke he'd never forgotten. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. The lamp's light trembled, throwing long shadows across the walls. "I once rode through your lands," he said slowly, "long time ago." Tala's eyes lifted to meet his. "Then you know what they did to us." He nodded. "I know." Silence again, heavy and fragile. Outside, a coyote cried somewhere in the distance. The sound carried across the plains, lonely and long. Illy stood and walked to the window, staring into the night. The moon hung bright above the riverbed, pale and distant like a watchful ghost. "You said your father went looking for you," he said. "If he's still alive, he'll come here, he'll find you." Tala rose from her chair, moving to stand beside him. The lamplight brushed her face strong, scarred by dust and hunger, but unbroken. "He will come," she said, "and if he finds you helped us, he will not forget." Illy turned his face slightly, the hint of a bitter smile crossing his lips. "Then maybe I'll get the ending I've been running from." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the moonlight touched the far ridges like the edge of an old scar. "I mean," he said softly, "a man can't live forever hiding from his own sins." The wind began to stir again, faint, whispering through the cracks of the shack like voices from another life. Tala shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. "You carry ghosts, Cowboy," she said, "but not all ghosts are meant to haunt. Some come to lead us back." Illy looked at her, and for the first time there was something human in his eyes again, not the cold stare of a drifter, but the weary reflection of a man who'd once believed in mercy. He walked back to the table, poured the last of his water into a tin cup, and pushed it toward her. "Drink," he said. "You need it more than I do." She hesitated, then took it. Her hands brushed his for a brief moment. Her skin was warm despite the chill. Outside, the wind grew stronger, carrying the sound of something far off, the faint beat of a drum. Tala's head turned sharply. "Do you hear that?" Illy did. A slow, rhythmic pulse rising and fading on the night air, distant but steady, like a heartbeat buried in the canyon walls. He moved to the door and opened it. The plains stretched out under the moon, silver and still. And far on the horizon, beyond the black line of the ridge, a flicker of red light. "Fires, they're close," Illy muttered. Tala stepped beside him, eyes wide. "It's them." She whispered, "My people." The night that had been so quiet now trembled with the echo of drums, slow, deep, growing louder. Illy's hand rested on the doorframe, his jaw set. "Then tomorrow," he said, voice low and steady, "tomorrow the past comes riding." And as the last words left his lips, the wind carried a faint chant across the plains, a song older than the land itself. A song of homecoming and reckoning. The drums grew louder through the night, not the sound of war yet, but of something ancient, something waiting. They rose and fell with the wind, their rhythm steady as a heartbeat, echoing across the empty plains. Illy sat outside by the fire, hat low over his eyes, his rifle resting across his knees. The flames crackled, throwing gold and red against the black sky. He hadn't slept since the shooting, his thoughts wouldn't let him. Each flicker of firelight carried a memory he wished the dark could hide. Behind him, inside the shack, Tala hummed softly a song from her people, one of mourning and protection. It was the kind of sound that could calm a restless spirit, even for a moment. Nita slept by the hearth, her breathing shallow but peaceful. The night air was cold enough to make the boards creak. Illy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of dried bread, the last of what he had. He looked at it for a long time before tossing it into the fire. The flames hissed, swallowing it whole. "That's what mercy costs," he muttered under his breath. The door opened behind him. Tala stepped out, a shawl around her shoulders, her hair loose and dark as the night itself. "You shouldn't sit alone," she said softly. "The wind brings bad dreams." He didn't look at her. "Dreams are better company than I deserve." She walked closer, the fire painting her face in shifting gold. "You speak like a man who's already dead." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." They stood in silence a while, listening to the fire, the drums, and the slow cry of the night birds beyond the ridge. Then she knelt beside the flames, staring into them as if she could read something there. "When I was a child," she said quietly, "my father told me that every man carries two fires inside him, one that destroys, one that gives life. The one that wins is the one we feed." Illy's eyes lifted from the fire. He studied her face, the strength in her voice, the calm in her sorrow. "And which one do you think I've been feeding?" She didn't answer right away. She reached out and stirred the fire with a stick, sparks leaping upward into the cold. "You gave your bread to strangers," she said. "That is not the act of a man feeding the fire of death." Illy looked away, jaw tightening. "You don't know what I've done. Then tell me." Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't plead. It was quiet, steady, like someone asking for the truth, not to judge, but to understand. Illy stared into the flames. The sound of the drums faded for a moment, and all he could hear was his heartbeat. He took a slow breath. "Years ago, before this land turned me into a ghost, I wore a different kind of coat. I rode with the army scouts and soldiers sent to tame the territories." He paused, the word tame tasting like ash. "We were told to burn an Apache village. They said it was revenge, said it would end the raids, but there were no warriors there that night. Only women, children, old men." The words came out heavy, like stones dropped into the dirt. "When the fire took the huts, I saw a child trying to crawl out. I tried to stop it, tried to help. My captain stopped me with his gun. He went quiet. The fire popped once, the sound sharp against the stillness." Tala's eyes glistened, but she didn't move. "That village." She whispered, voice breaking. "Was it near the White Mesa?" Illy nodded slowly. "Yes, White Mesa." Tala's breath caught. Her hand went to her mouth. "That was us." He closed his eyes. The silence that followed felt like judgment itself. "Then you know why I can't ask forgiveness," he said quietly. Tala turned to him, her face caught between grief and disbelief. "You burned our home." Illy nodded. "I did, and I've carried that fire inside me ever since. Every mile I've walked, every night I've starved, it was all trying to make peace with ghosts that don't forgive." The wind rose, scattering ash into the night. For a long while, neither spoke. Only the fire moved, and the drums beyond the horizon beat slower now, distant as thunder. Then, softly, Tala said, "If my father finds you, he will want blood. That is the law of pain. But—" She looked at him again, eyes softer than before. "I saw what you did for us. You shared what little you had. My sister lives because of you, and no man who carries light in his hands can be all darkness." Illy looked at her, then really looked. Her face, her words, her forgiveness, it felt like the first rain after years of dust. "You shouldn't forgive me," he said. "Not ever." "Maybe not," she answered, "but someone has to stop feeding the fire." A long silence hung between them. The moon had climbed higher, pale and watchful. The drums had faded into quiet, replaced by the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Illy stood, picking up his rifle, his voice low. "They'll be here by dawn." Tala rose too, facing him. "And what will you do when they come?" He looked toward the horizon where the fires still flickered faintly. "I'll do what I should have done a long time ago," he said. "Face the ones I wronged with nothing left to hide behind." Tala nodded slowly. "Then may your fire bring peace this time." He gave a small nod of thanks. Then he turned and stared out at the endless plain where night met the edge of light. In the quiet between the wind and the heartbeat of the earth, Illy Boone waited not for mercy, not for escape, but for judgment that might finally set him free. The dawn broke cold and uncertain. Mist curled low over the prairie, wrapping the world in silence. The cowboy sat outside his cabin, his hat tipped low, the steam of his black coffee rising like smoke from an old memory. He had slept little. The image of the chief's stern eyes haunted him, eyes that carried the weight of command, tradition, and vengeance. From the distance came the faint sound of hooves, slow and deliberate. He stood up, every muscle tensed. The morning stillness cracked as a single rider emerged through the fog, the tribal scout who had first found him days ago. His face was unreadable. The scout dismounted, nodding respectfully. "The chief summons you," he said quietly. The cowboy only nodded. He grabbed his coat, mounted his horse, and followed the silent figure into the white mist. The journey was long and wordless. The fog thinned as the sun rose higher, revealing the plains stretching endlessly in every direction, golden grass rippling like the surface of a vast sea. Ahead, the tribal encampment shimmered in the light, tents of hide, totems standing tall, smoke from morning fires rising to the heavens. When they entered the camp, every head turned. The whispers followed him, the outsider, the stranger who had shared bread with the chief's daughters. Some faces showed respect, others suspicion. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, eyes wide, as if looking upon a ghost. The scout led him to the great tent at the center. There, guards stood with spears crossed. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, sage, and something ancient power itself. The chief sat cross-legged beside a fire pit, his eyes glowing in the flickering light. Around him were elders, men with painted faces, feathers, and scars carved by time. The cowboy removed his hat, his voice steady but low. "You called for me," he said. The chief studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching like a test. "You gave bread to my daughters when they were starving," the chief began, a gesture of kindness from a man with nothing. "But the world of men is never simple. Some in my tribe see your act as sacred. Others—" He paused, his gaze hardening. "As an insult." The cowboy met his eyes, unflinching. "Didn't mean no insult. They were hungry, that's all I saw." The chief nodded slowly, as though weighing the truth in his words. Then he gestured to one of the warriors, who stepped forward carrying a small wooden bowl filled with ashes. The chief lifted a handful, letting the ashes fall through his fingers. "In our ways," he said, "a deed carries both light and shadow. Feed one soul, and you may starve another. Heal one heart, and another may break. So tell me, white man, do you understand what your kindness has stirred?" The cowboy's jaw tightened. "I reckon I don't. But if it was wrong to help someone hungry, then I'll carry that wrong myself." A murmur rippled through the tent, disapproval from some, respect from others. The chief's lips curved in a faint smile, more sorrow than amusement. "You speak with a warrior's honesty," he said, "but words alone will not balance the weight you've placed upon our spirits." The cowboy felt the tension coil inside him. "What weight you talkin' about?" The chief's gaze softened, almost mournful. "The bread you gave my daughters shared it with a child from another clan. That child's death has brought blood between our people. Some blame the bread, some blame fate, and some—" He looked directly into the cowboy's eyes. "Blame you." The words hit like a gunshot. The tent's walls seemed to close in, the smoke thick and suffocating. The cowboy didn't flinch, but inside, the guilt twisted deep. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. The chief leaned forward, eyes glimmering with something unreadable, perhaps wisdom, perhaps sorrow. "You will ride with us at dawn," he said, "to face those who seek vengeance. If your heart is true, you will stand beside me. If not—" His voice dropped to a whisper. "The prairie will decide your fate." The fire crackled, throwing sparks like restless spirits. The cowboy stood there, silent, the world narrowing to that single moment, the line between life, redemption, and the endless horizon. Outside, the wind howled through the plains. The decision had been made. The dawn would bring blood or peace, and he would ride into it alone or as one of them. The sun bled slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in crimson and gold. The air was sharp, alive with tension. Warriors moved like shadows through the camp, painting their faces, checking their horses, tying charms of bone and leather around their necks. The sound of hooves, the rattle of arrows, the whisper of blades. A symphony of destiny. The cowboy stood at the edge of the camp, saddling his old horse in silence. He had faced death before, in storms, in duels, in lonely winters, but this felt different. This wasn't about survival. It was about truth, about facing what his kindness had set in motion. A small hand tugged at his coat. He turned. It was the younger of the two tribal sisters, the same one he had once given his last piece of bread. Her eyes were full of sorrow and strength beyond her years. She held out a necklace made of red stones and eagle feathers. "My father said you ride with us." She said softly, "Take this for protection." He took it gently, his rough hands trembling for the first time. "You keep it," he said. "You'll need it more than me." But she shook her head. "The spirits chose you. They see your heart." Before he could answer, the older sister appeared. Her face was painted for war lines of black and white, tracing down her cheeks like tears of fire and snow. She said nothing, just met his gaze for a moment, then turned to mount her horse beside her father. The chief raised his hand. "Ride." The camp erupted in motion, hundreds of horses surging across the plain, their hooves thundering like drums of the earth. Dust rose in great clouds, banners fluttering behind them. The cowboy rode in silence near the chief, the wind cutting through his coat, his heart pounding with the rhythm of the charge. They rode for miles, until the plains opened wide before them, a dry valley marked by ancient stones. Across that valley, another tribe had gathered, faces painted in blue and ash, spears glinting in the rising sun. Two nations stood on the edge of war, both believing they fought for the dead child whose soul had not yet found peace. The horses slowed to a stop. Silence fell heavy, sacred. The chief dismounted, as did the cowboy. The air between the two tribes shimmered with heat and hatred. A tall warrior stepped forward from the opposing side, his eyes cold as flint. "You bring the outsider who cursed us," he shouted. "Let him answer for the child's death." The chief raised a hand. "He will answer, but not with fear. The spirits will see his truth." All eyes turned to the cowboy. Dust clung to his boots as he stepped forward, hat in hand. His voice carried across the valley, low and steady. "I didn't bring death," he said. "I brought bread to the hungry, to those I thought needed it more than me. I didn't know the child would die. But if you believe that makes me guilty, then I'll face your judgment." The wind shifted, scattering the dust like ashes. The opposing warrior's jaw tightened, his spear trembling in his grip. For a moment, it seemed blood would spill. Then the elder from the rival tribe, an old man wrapped in wolf fur, stepped forward. His voice broke the tension like thunder after lightning. "The spirits have spoken through dreams," he said. "The child's death was not by poison nor curse. It was fever. The outsider's bread carried no shadow." A murmur swept through both sides, disbelief, relief, confusion. The cowboy's breath left his chest like a sigh of thunder. The chief closed his eyes for a long moment, as if releasing years of weight. The old man lifted his hand toward the sky. "Let there be no war today," he said. "Let the prairie rest." The tribes lowered their weapons. The air shifted from fury to fragile calm. The chief turned to the cowboy. "You have walked through our fire," he said quietly. "You are no longer an outsider." The cowboy nodded once, words caught in his throat. He looked out across the valley, the dust settling like snow, and for the first time in a long while he felt peace. As they rode back toward the fading sun, the young sister rode beside him, smiling faintly. "The spirits were right," she whispered. "You were meant to come." The cowboy tipped his hat, his eyes on the endless horizon. "Maybe," he said softly, "or maybe the world just needed one man to share his bread." The wind carried his words into the golden dusk, and somewhere beyond the plains, the earth itself seemed to breathe easier. The night came alive with drums. For the first time in many moons, the air in the tribal valley carried laughter instead of war cries. Fires burned high, casting warm light over painted faces, shimmering beads, and horses resting under the stars. The scent of roasted corn and venison drifted across the plains, mingling with the soft hum of flutes. It was a night of peace, hard, earned, fragile, and beautiful. The cowboy sat near the edge of the great circle, hat low over his eyes, watching it all unfold. He wasn't used to celebration. His world had always been quiet, the lonely creak of saddle leather, the whistle of wind through canyon stone. But tonight, the sound of joy reached him, slow and gentle, like a healing wind over old scars. The chief stood at the center of the gathering. His daughters were beside him, dressed in ceremonial colors, red for courage, white for renewal. Around them the tribe danced in rhythm, each step echoing the heartbeat of the land. When the drums softened, the chief raised his hand. Silence rippled through the crowd. He spoke in a deep, measured voice, one that carried both strength and grace. "Tonight," he said, "the spirits have smiled upon us. The fire burns not for battle, but for brotherhood. The man who came to us as a stranger now stands among us as kin." He gestured to the cowboy. Every head turned. The cowboy hesitated, uncomfortable under the gaze of so many eyes. The young sister nodded toward him, her smile soft but certain. Slowly, he rose to his feet and walked to the firelight. Shadows danced across his face, carving the lines of a man who'd lived through too much, yet never stopped trying to do right. "I don't got many words," he said quietly. "I never did. I only did what felt right at the time. Given bread ain't much of a thing, but maybe it's the only thing a man can do when the world's gone hard. I didn't come here for thanks, but—" He paused, looking around the circle. "I'm grateful for what you've shown me tonight, for teaching me that kindness don't die easy even out here." The silence that followed was deep and sacred. Then the chief nodded, and the drums began again, slow at first, then faster, building with every heartbeat. The people cheered. Children ran around the fire, laughter echoing into the night. The older daughter approached the cowboy. Her face, once guarded and cold, now carried something softer, a quiet respect. She handed him a carved wooden cup filled with sweetened drink. "My father says every soul who keeps his word must drink to the dawn," she said. He smiled faintly. "Then I reckon I'll drink to that." They raised their cups to the sky. The fire cracked, the stars shimmered, and for a moment the entire world seemed to stand still. Later that night, as the music faded and most had drifted away, the cowboy sat alone beside the dying fire. The chief joined him, lowering himself slowly to the ground. For a while neither spoke. The flames whispered between them. "You brought peace," the chief said at last, "not with weapons, not with pride, but with bread. That is a lesson even old men like me must remember." The cowboy stared into the fire. "Peace don't last forever," he said quietly, "but maybe it don't have to. Maybe it just needs to happen once for folks to remember what it looks like." The chief nodded. "And that is enough." The night wind stirred the embers, sending sparks dancing into the dark sky. Somewhere beyond the circle of light, coyotes howled not in warning this time, but in harmony with the land that had finally found its calm. And as the cowboy lifted his gaze to the stars, he wondered not for the first time if the world could ever be healed by simple acts done with honest hands. When dawn came, it came soft golden light spilling over the hills, kissing the earth awake. The fires had burned down to embers, smoke curling upward like prayers. Most of the tribe still slept, their dreams light after the long night of peace. Only a few figures moved quietly among the tents, the old, the watchful, and one weary cowboy, already saddling his horse. He worked in silence, his hand steady, though his heart was heavy. He knew what morning meant. Peace had come, yes, but peace never stayed long. His place was the road, not the hearth. The prairie had always called him back, and he never knew how to say no to it. A soft voice broke the quiet. "You're leaving." He turned. The older sister stood there, her hair loose, eyes dark against the pale sky. She held something wrapped in deerskin. "I figured I should," he said simply. "World's got more hungry folks than just here." She stepped closer, the faint scent of sage around her. "My father said you would go," she murmured, "but he told me to give you this." She unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a pendant, a silver piece shaped like a star, with a stone of turquoise at its center. The edges were worn smooth by years of touch. It shimmered faintly in the light. "It belonged to my grandfather," she said. "He called it the morning star. He said it guides those who walk between worlds, the wanderers, the lost, the ones who carry peace without knowing it." The cowboy hesitated, his throat tight. "I can't take something like that," he said softly. "It means too much." She shook her head. "It means what you've already earned." For a long moment neither spoke. Then he took the pendant, turning it in his palm. "Tell your father, thank you for trustin' me." The younger sister appeared then, sleepy-eyed, clutching a small wooden doll. "Will you come back?" she asked. He looked at her at the innocence that still believed in forever and smiled gently. "Maybe one day," he said. "But if I don't, you just look up at the sky before dawn. That's when I'll be ridden between the stars." The girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood the poetry of his words. The older sister placed her hand over her heart in quiet farewell. The chief stood at a distance, watching. When the cowboy met his eyes, no words were needed. The nod they shared said everything: respect, gratitude, and the silent bond of men who had stood on the same edge of life and come back changed. The cowboy swung into the saddle. The wind tugged at his coat, lifting the dust beneath his horse's hooves. He looked once more at the camp, at the smoke rising gently, the tribe stirring, the children laughing in the distance. For a man who had lost more than he could count, this place had given him something rare: belonging, even if only for a moment. He touched the morning star around his neck. It caught the light, flashing blue against the gold of dawn. Then he turned his horse toward the open plains. The wind rose, carrying his whisper across the land: "Ride easy, folks. Keep your hearts kind." And with that, he was gone, a lone figure fading into the sunlit horizon, leaving behind nothing but hoof prints, hope, and a story that would be told for generations. They would say he came with nothing but bread, and left with the blessing of a people who once called him stranger and now called him brother. The sun had barely climbed above the ridges when Illy Boone felt the wind shift, that sharp, metallic edge that carried more than just air. It carried trouble. He'd been mending the corral fence, one hand wrapped in a dirty bandage, when his horse began to snort and stamp. Birds broke from the trees like a warning shot. And in the distance, where the canyon met the plains, dust was rising again, not from the tribe this time, but from men who rode with iron in their hearts. Bounty hunters. He knew their kind. Men paid to hunt ghosts and the living who looked like M. Illy's eyes narrowed against the light. He counted 5 riders, maybe 6, each moving like a storm front. One had a red scarf trailing behind him. Another carried a rifle slung across his back, the kind of men who didn't talk first. He turned to the sister's tent. "Tala, Nita," he called quietly, "get inside the barn. Don't come out unless I say." The older one, Tala, appeared in the doorway. Her face had changed since that first night, not from fear anymore, but strength. "Who are they?" she asked. Illy spat into the dust, the kind that smell coin and blood. Nita stepped forward. "They want you." He gave a grim half-smile. "Or anyone they can call an Indian lover. Out here, that's worth the same bounty." The wind pressed at his coat, carrying the smell of smoke and iron. Illy moved toward the porch, loading shells into his old Winchester. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, from memory. Every sound, every click of the gun brought back those nights in the war, the fire, the screams, the guilt he thought he'd buried under a decade of dust. Now it was all coming back to claim him. The riders crested the ridge, their shadows long on the ground. One called out, voice sharp as a whip, "Boone, you got 2 red girls hidden there. Word is, they belong to the chief who raided Fort Mason last spring. Now, we ain't here for talk, hand 'em over, or we'll take what's ours." Illy didn't answer. He stood in the open, rifle low, the wind tugging at his hat brim. Behind him, the sisters waited in silence, hidden among the horses and grain sacks. Then a new sound cut through the morning, a single drumbeat, low and deep, rolling across the plains like thunder. The bounty hunters turned, startled, and from the opposite ridge, smoke rose again, this time black and heavy, curling toward the sky like a signal. Illy's chest tightened. The tribe had returned. Across the field, shapes began to move, silent riders, hundreds strong, their spears glinting like glass in the light. The chief rode at the front, his feathered headdress catching the wind, eyes set straight ahead. The bounty hunters cursed and scattered their horses, shouting, but there was no running now. The land itself had closed its circle. Illy stepped forward, his voice steady at last. "You boys came for blood," he said quietly. Looks like you found it. The first shot cracked the silence wide open. Dust exploded from the ground, the war drums began to thunder, and the morning turned red. The plains had seen their share of death, but this time it was for redemption. And Eli Boone, the man who once burned a village, would now defend one. The sound of rifles split the morning wide open. Dust burst from the ground in clouds as lead tore through the air. The bounty hunters fanned out, shouting curses, firing blind toward the ridge where the warriors descended like a wave of wind and thunder. Eli Boone dropped behind the fence post, rifle braced against the wood, eyes locked on the line of riders charging in. His heartbeat found rhythm with the drums that shook the valley. He took a slow breath, squeezed the trigger one clean shot. A bounty man fell backward from his horse, his hat spinning into the dust. The sisters crouched behind the barn wall, their faces streaked with sweat and fear. Nita clutched her sister's arm. "They'll kill him," she whispered. Tala's jaw clenched. "Not today." Inside, she loaded Eli's spare revolver, the weight heavy in her hands, but her eyes steady. Outside, Eli reloaded again and again, each movement calm, mechanical. The same hands that once destroyed now fought to protect. The chief's warriors rode in from the canyon, forming a crescent that cut through the bounty hunters like a blade. Spears flashed, arrows whistled through the smoke. The air grew thick with dust and gunpowder, the smell of metal and earth mingling in one raw breath of war. A rifle cracked close by. Eli felt a hot sting slice across his shoulder. He stumbled, blood darkening his sleeve. He pressed his hand over it, gritting his teeth. Not yet, not till it's done. A bounty hunter lunged from behind a wagon, knife raised. Eli turned, but before he could fire, a sharp whistle cut through the chaos and the man froze. An arrow had buried itself deep in his chest. Tala stood a few yards away, bow drawn, eyes blazing like amber in the smoke. "You fight," she called over the noise. "We fight too." Eli gave a quick nod, grim and grateful, then turned back to the battle. The chief rode in at full gallop, his war cry splitting the air. His warriors closed the circle tighter, forcing the last bounty men toward the open field. There, surrounded by wind and gunfire, the hunters realized they weren't hunters anymore. When the last shot rang out, it echoed across the plains like a bell at a funeral. Silence followed, deep, heavy, sacred. Only the wind moved, lifting the dust off the bodies that lay scattered among the sage. Eli dropped his rifle and sank to one knee. Blood dripped from his fingers, mixing with the dirt. The chief dismounted slowly, walking through the field of the fallen. He stopped before Eli, eyes unreadable beneath the feathers. "You bleed for my people," the chief said in his deep, calm voice. "Once you brought fire, today you bring rain." Eli looked up, pain in his voice. "I didn't do it for forgiveness." The chief nodded. "Then you have it." He reached down, pressing something into Eli's hand, a small carved pendant made from river stone, etched with tribal markings. "You are no longer the man who burned our village," he said. "From this day you are Naha, the man who gave bread in hunger." The wind carried the words through the camp like a prayer. Warriors lowered their heads, the sisters stepped forward, tears bright in their eyes. Tala placed her hand gently on Eli's wounded shoulder. "You're one of us now," she said softly. Thunder rolled in the distance, not from guns this time, but from clouds. The first drops of rain began to fall slow, steady, washing blood from the earth. It fell on wood and flesh alike, on bounty men and warriors, on Eli Boone's bowed head. And as it rained, the dust of war turned to mud, and the land began to breathe again. Eli lifted his face to the sky, eyes closed, whispering a broken prayer not for mercy, but for peace. For the first time, it didn't feel like the world was punishing him. It felt like it was forgiving him. That morning, the plains of Arizona saw no victors, only men reborn. And beneath that cleansing rain, the name Naha was carried on the wind, the man who gave bread in hunger, and bled for the same hands he once wronged. The rain had fallen all night, a soft, endless whisper that turned the dry ground into a dark mirror of mud and memory. When the dawn finally came, it was pale and gentle, like a mercy the land had long forgotten. Boone woke to the sound of dripping water from the barn roof. His body ached with every breath. Bandages wrapped his shoulder, rough but careful, done by hands that trembled with kindness. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Tala sitting beside him, her dark hair damp, her gaze steady and calm. She was grinding herbs in a wooden bowl, her movements slow, deliberate. "You're awake," she said quietly. "The fever's past." Illy blinked, throat dry. "Feels like I've been run over by my own horse." Tala smiled faintly, a rare, tired smile. "You almost were." He tried to sit up, but she pressed a hand gently to his chest. "Rest," she murmured. "The wound needs stillness." Illy obeyed, eyes drifting to the open barn door. The world outside was washed clean, the blood, the smoke, the footprints all gone beneath a thin silver fog. The only color that remained was the deep red of the sunrise bleeding through the mist. Nita appeared at the door, her small frame wrapped in a wool blanket. She carried a clay cup steaming with some bitter-smelling brew. "For your pain," she said shyly. Illy took it, winced at the taste, and smiled weakly. "Reminds me of the coffee back in Abilene." The sisters laughed, the sound light and rare, cutting through the stillness like a promise of better days. But as the laughter faded, Illy's eyes grew distant. His gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the hills, empty now, where the tribe had camped the night before. "They're gone," he said softly. Tala nodded. "They left before dawn. My father said the land needs time to forget. He said you would understand." Illy's fingers tightened around the cup. He did understand. He knew what it meant to leave quietly, to carry the weight of yesterday's sins into tomorrow's silence. Still, the emptiness hurt not because they were gone, but because they had accepted him before they left. That kind of grace burned deeper than any wound. Tala reached into her pouch and handed him something small, the river stone pendant the chief had given him, now bound with a leather cord. "He told me to make sure you wear it," she said. "He said it's not a gift, it's a name." Illy stared at it for a long moment. The stone was smooth, cool to the touch, carved with a single mark, the same shape that had been on the tribe's banners. He slipped it around his neck, and for the first time in years he didn't feel cursed by the past. He felt seen. Outside, the rain began to fade into a soft drizzle. The prairie stretched endless, washed of all violence, gleaming like glass under the newborn sun. Illy rose slowly, each movement heavy with ache. He stepped to the doorway and stood there, looking out at the open world. The horses grazed quietly. The air smelled of wet earth and cedar. Every breath felt like forgiveness. Behind him, Tala's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "What will you do now?" Illy looked at the horizon, the faint glow of gold breaking through the clouds. "I reckon I'll stay a while," he said. "This land's got some healing left in it. Maybe so do I." The wind shifted, lifting the edges of his coat. It carried the faintest echo, the sound of drums, distant but not gone. A promise that peace, once found, could last if men were willing to remember it. And for the first time in a long time, Boone smiled not from relief, but from hope. Hope that the man who once brought fire might now learn to live in the rain. The morning rose heavy with silence. Even the wind seemed afraid to move through the valley. Smoke still whispered from the ruins of the chief's tent, and the once proud drums of the Apache tribe lay shattered in the dust, their rhythm gone. The cowboy stood alone beside the sacred fire pit, its embers fading, its warmth barely reaching his calloused hands. He had fought not for gold, not for pride, but for the promise of peace, for the bread he once shared under a dying sun. Two shadows approached the tribal sisters, their faces solemn, their hands still marked with soot and tears. They carried the chief's headdress, its feathers torn, its beads reflecting the morning light like fallen stars. The elder sister spoke softly, a voice trembling with both pain and gratitude. "He left with honor. He said your kindness was greater than his war." The cowboy lowered his head. The desert seemed to hold its breath. For a long moment, there was nothing but the faint rustle of ashes and the cry of a lone eagle circling high above. Then, slowly, the younger sister stepped forward, her eyes glistening with something deeper than sorrow. She placed a single bead blue as the sky into his palm. "A gift," she said, "so the spirits will know your name." He looked down at it, then at the faces of those who remained, a people who had lost so much, yet still found grace enough to forgive. He turned to his horse, its mane glinting like silver under the dawn, and for a moment he almost smiled. "Maybe someday," he whispered, "this land'll learn how to live without blood." He climbed into the saddle. The wind caught his coat, lifting the dust of battle behind him. As he rode away, the sisters stood side by side, watching that lone figure disappear into the burning horizon, a man who had come with nothing, given everything, and left behind a story the desert would never forget. And so the poor cowboy rode on, carrying no riches, only the weight of a promise kept, and the memory of two sisters who once shared his bread beneath the dying sun. The desert had healed slowly. Months passed like years beneath that endless sky. The scars of battle faded, and in their place grew whispered stories told from one campfire to another about the stranger who gave without asking, and the chief who found peace before his last breath. Far beyond those red canyons, the cowboy rode alone, a shadow against the morning blaze. The world around him had grown quiet, but inside, the echoes of that night still stirred. He carried no map, no treasure, just the blue bead tied to his saddle rope, a single reminder that kindness had once changed the course of an entire tribe. He stopped at a ridge overlooking the river, the same river where it had all begun. The water shimmered, calm now, as if the earth itself had forgiven the fire. He dismounted, knelt beside the current, and let the bead slip into the flow. "You belong to the wind now," he murmured. The current caught it, carried it downstream, past rocks, past roots, past the places where memory fades but meaning stays. He stayed there for a long while, listening to the song of the river, a song that spoke of endings and beginnings all the same. The sun climbed higher, its warmth brushing his shoulders like an old friend's hand saying goodbye. In the distance, a group of riders appeared, young men in brown coats, dust rising behind them. They weren't warriors, just travelers, drifters, chasing the same promise he once did. As they passed, one called out, "You're the cowboy from the Apache stories, ain't ya?" He smiled faintly. "Stories belong to those who tell 'em." He replied, tipping his hat. They rode on, and he watched them vanish into the same horizon that had once swallowed him whole. Every man leaves a trail, some carved in dust, others written in hearts, and though his journey was nearly done, the trail he left behind wasn't one of conquest, but of compassion, etched forever beneath the desert sun. The wind rises, carrying the faint sound of drums, peaceful this time, not of war, but remembrance. Days turned into weeks, and the cowboy's trail led him deeper into the plains where the earth met the sky, and the world felt endless again. He rode not to chase fortune, but to keep a promise to live gentle, to give more than he took, and to never let the desert forget that mercy once bloomed in its heart. At dusk, he stopped beside an old willow tree, its roots clutching the soil like memories refusing to fade. He built a small fire, its glow flickering against his worn face, illuminating eyes that had seen too much yet still believed in good. From his satchel, he pulled a small piece of dried bread, the same kind he had once shared with the two tribal sisters. He broke it in half, set one piece upon a flat stone, and whispered softly, "For them, for the chief, for what peace costs a man." The wind carried his words away, spreading them across the canyon like prayer smoke. Then came the sound, the faint rhythm of hooves in the far distance. Not enemies, not warriors, just two silhouettes, riding slow, side by side, their hair long, braided, catching the last light of sunset. The sisters, they had found him. No words were spoken at first, only the silence of reunion, a silence that said everything words never could. They sat by his fire, shared his bread again, and for a moment time bowed its head. The elder sister spoke, her tone calm, steady as the earth itself. The tribe sings of you now, not as a stranger, but as one of us." He looked into the flames, eyes reflecting gold and sorrow. "I ain't much for songs," he said. "But I reckon that means I did something right." The younger sister smiled, soft, proud, unbroken. "You gave what no gold could buy honor." The fire crackled. Above them, the night stretched wide and silent, filled with stars that looked like the eyes of ancestors watching on. When dawn came, they said their farewells, no tears, just three riders staring into a horizon that promised peace. He mounted his horse one last time, the wind tugging at his coat, the rising sun painting him in amber and red. As he turned to go, the sisters raised their hands in a quiet blessing, and as his figure faded into the glowing dust, their voices carried softly through the air. "The man who gave his bread gave life to our people." And so the cowboy rode beyond the sunrise, his shadow stretching across the golden land, a reminder that even in the harshest desert, a single act of kindness can echo longer than a lifetime, fade out. The wind hums low, the screen darkens to the whisper of a guitar string,